Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
The subject of the talk is, just to give it a short title, would be Ananda as a role model for gay male Buddhists. And Ananda, for those of you who may not be familiar, was the personal attendant of Shakyamuni Buddha, kind of a combination of chief of staff and road manager and gentleman's gentleman, a person who was really the closest to the historical Buddha during his teaching career. The long title of the talk is I'm calling it pining away for the sight of the handsome Naga king. And the subtitle is Queer Reading of Pali Texts about Ananda. And all this will, I hope, become clear during the course of this talk. I think Winston was a little worried about my giving an academic talk here, and I hope this will be something that will really be of interest, especially to this group, because I'm not a believer in just simply researching something just for the sake of pure academic interest. I don't think that really is the case. I think whatever people study and how they study it is determined by some agendas that they have, especially in this field. And my agenda is pretty much up front that my partner and I have been working for many years looking at queer identities, and especially in ancient India and Buddhism and in other parts of Indian culture. And it's part of the project that we want to reclaim these identities as part of our queer history. Because we really believe that there is a continuum, that we are a distinct people, and that there have been queer people throughout history in every culture. And this history has really been very much obscured. So just as Winston has done with many of his books, we want to bring some of this history to light. I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about why this topic might be relevant for people here. Why would this be important other than kind of a curiosity? And I guess first thing I'd want to talk about would be the importance of role models for gay men. And maybe that's obvious, so I'll just talk about that kind of briefly. In coming out and becoming gay and learning, in becoming part of gay culture, role models are just really, really important, especially for those of us who've grown up in places where it's been very stigmatized to be gay. And I can remember being a kid in the 50s, and which was just about the most homophobic period that you can possibly imagine. I mean, to be homosexual was just about the worst thing you could be, other than a communist. And I was pretty sympathetic to communism, too, so felt rather alienated. And I can remember as a kid just going through books and being at the library and finding these people, and Socrates and Plato and Michelangelo and Oscar Wilde, and sort of realizing that, here are people who felt as I felt, and I'm sure many of you have had this kind of experience, and being able to get some kind of comfort from that, and being able to see that a person can live a meaningful life and a very important life, and still love other men. And so it's And also, being gay is the only culture in which I don't think anyone is really born into that culture. And maybe nowadays that's changing, that gay people are raising families and some of the kids will be gay and maybe they'll grow up in a gay environment. But up until now, being gay is a culture one becomes part of and chooses. I mean, the orientation isn't something one chooses, but the culture is certainly something that's learned. And, just as black kids or Jewish kids or Irish kids or Spanish kids have a sense of being connected to other people in their culture, great people biologically who have been connected to them or genetically connected to them, I think we also have a need for a lineage, being part of a lineage of gay people. And just as a priest, for example, becomes part of the church and is part of a lineage going back to the days of Christ, a person becomes a priest and becomes part of that lineage and part of that culture. And I think that's true for being a gay man too, that we become part of a lineage, and there's even a sexual connection. There's a story I think I know other people have been familiar with, the story of being connected with some of the great people in modern gay history through sexual contact. And Allen Ginsberg always figures in this part of the story. Where, there are 1 or 2 degrees of separation here. And, for example, when I was much younger, a good friend of mine that I had slept with Allen Ginsberg. And Allen Ginsberg had slept with someone who had slept with someone who slept with Edward Carpenter, who was the great British gay reformer in the early part of this century and the latter part of the 19th century. And Carpenter himself had a famous story of Carpenter meeting Walt Whitman and kissing Walt Whitman. So in a way, anyone who slept with Ginsberg goes back at least to Walt Whitman, and Lord knows before then, because Whitman certainly had many partners, and probably going back to Socrates. So we can feel connected in this way to other gay men throughout history. And in the same way, getting a little more specific here, there's the whole question of models of how to be a Buddhist. And I don't know if anyone here in this room was actually born into a Buddhist culture. One person, yeah. The rest of us, 2 people, the rest of us have had to learn this in the same way that we learn to be part of gay culture. We've had to learn how to be a Buddhist. And what does that mean? And how do we learn that? I mean, part of it, of course, is just like being here and learning and sitting together and being together with other gay Buddhists. We, of course, learn from our teachers. We learn from our Dharma brothers. And there certainly is a multiplicity of voices, of ways to be Buddhists that are presented to people today. Some of you may be familiar with Winston's new book, Queer Dharma, and the subtitle of the book is Voices of Gay Buddhists. And it's a wonderful book. I certainly would recommend everybody look at that. And it's a good subtitle because it really is just a variety of voices. And while that's a wonderful thing, I would think that for someone who perhaps is just starting out, just beginning to learn about Buddhism, that there may be a lot of confusion. Exactly what is this about? How do you act in a Buddhist way? And because people have many different views of that. And part of the beauty of Buddhism, as I see it, is that it is a very, very open, expansive kind of system. It accommodates a wide variety of views. The famous phrase about there being 100,000 or 10 million types of dharmas for the 10 million types of individuals. That, you know, it's not a one-size-fit-all kind of a deal. And yet, I would propose that there are some things that are not Buddhism. Part of the foundation of the Buddhist path is what's called right view, or right views. And the fact that there's a right view implies that there are wrong views or mistaken views. And Buddhist texts are very clear about that there are certain views such as belief in a creator God, or belief in sacrifice, animal sacrifice, as the Hindus practiced it in the time of the Buddha. These are definitely wrong views, and if one follows these types of views, one will be led away from what the goals of Buddhism are. So I think it's very important for people to have good models or role models for learning to be Buddhist and learning to practice. And again, there certainly have been gay Buddhists who have served that function, such as Isan Dorsey, Roshi, Allen Ginsberg himself, and other people. Of course, the people we have around us and our teachers are most important, but I also think there is a need for a historical connection of feeling a connection to gay Buddhists throughout history, which is segueing into my paper. And I've always been attracted to the figure of Ananda, and I didn't quite know why, but just starting to read some of the Pali texts which discuss him, and I realized that it just jumped right out at me that this is a person, or at least the way he's presented in the text, because we can't really know anything for certain historically about the early history of Buddhism, but just the figure of Ananda as presented in the text strikes me as a very queer figure. And I'd like to present some of these ideas. I think this is hopefully not just something that I've dreamed up or out of my own wishful thinking, but I think it's right there in the text. And I'd like to look at the implications for queer Buddhists of having such a view of Ananda, and just briefly look at some of the larger questions of the problematics of same-sex affection for Buddhist practitioners. Ananda is one of the most attractively human figures found in the Buddhist canon, Buddhist writings. And in a way, there's a particular qualities about him that suggest that there may be some memories preserved of an actual human figure, because it's in discussing Ananda, we have some characteristics that are not the usual stories of a perfect person, of a saint, but there are some very human characteristics that come through, and these are it's not the usual very dry detachment that you find in the Pali canon when discussing the arhats or the saints. He's presented as a very tenderly emotional person with a human love for others, and also having a brilliant command of the Dharma and of Buddhist wisdom. And what really, first and foremost, was his devotion to the Buddha. And when the Buddha was dying, he was so affected by this that Ananda became vicariously ill out of his extreme empathy. Quote, when he saw how badly ill the Buddha was, his body became weak, The horizon became dim, and his senses were not clear, unquote. And as the Buddha was dying, Ananda burst into tears, which prompted a very famous Buddhist sermon on impermanence. And as one writer put it, Ananda's words at the death of the Master were not those of a saint risen above everything worldly. They were the words of a man mourning the loss of a beloved master, friend, and companion. And in fact, his attachment to the Buddha, his emotional attachment, was so great that he was not able to attain sainthood or arhatship during the Buddha's lifetime, and other people did. He was only able to achieve that after the parinirvana, after the final nirvana of the Buddha. And even though he was the person who was the greatest master of the Buddha's words and teachings, because he was the closest person to the Buddha, and he was very eager to learn anything he could and have the Buddha repeat his discourses and clarify things, he was not admitted to the first Buddhist council that occurred after the Buddha's death. He was not initially admitted because he was not seen as being free from all of the passions of the klesha. And I think part of this was his own emotional attachment to the Buddha. And not only to the Buddha, but he also had emotional attachment to some of his peers, especially Shariputra, who was also one of the great saints and arhats around the Buddha. And Shariputra also died before Ananda. And at that time, it also is a very vivid description, when he heard of Shariputra's death, Ananda felt as though his whole body was drugged. His senses were confused and his mind became blank. And commentary adds that Ananda was trembling like a bird escaping from a cat's mouth. And this is just a wonderful description of a very human grief reaction. And by the way, for those of you, Ananda's name in Sanskrit translates as joy or bliss or happiness, or with slightest stretch you could say it means gay in the larger sense of the word. I just wanted to share that. And looking at the relationship between Buddha and Ananda, I think there's a mirror here of the Platonic relationship between the ideal Platonic relationship between the lover and the beloved. The non-sexual love of a younger man for an older man who leads the younger man to wisdom through his teaching. I mean, this is what the Platonic ideal is, and really this is what we also find this in Buddhism. Ananda is usually described as a cousin or other kinsman of the Buddha. And while in Pali texts he's said to be the same age as the Buddha, in the Tibetan Vinaya and some other Mahayana works, he was said to have been born on the day of the Buddha's enlightenment, which is at age 35. And so he was 2 generations younger than the Buddha. So you have this kind of age discrepancy, at least in these texts. And when he was asked to become the Buddha's personal attendant, there were 8 conditions that he gave, and mostly these are things in which he wanted to be sure that he himself was not in the spotlight. He was very, very modest, and one of the conditions was that he should not be asked to stay in the Buddha's, the fragrant cell, as was called, of the Buddha, his own room. And, this is perhaps just to be ascribed to his modesty, but I also wonder whether it betokens some kind of awareness of a danger of being too physically close to his beloved master, and given his kind of emotional attachment. And the relationship between Buddha and Ananda has served as a model, a paradigm for the Buddhist student-teacher relationship down through the years. And it's in this sense that my late friend, Buddhist monk Elvin Jones, died about 3 weeks ago, in which I'm dedicating this paper to him. And Elvin stated that homosexual relations can be good if they lead to spiritual goals. And this kind of view is very much in the spirit of Buddhism as a living religion and of the whole Indian tradition. And one writer, J. Garrett Jones, says, the Indian tradition has never seen warm, tender, loving feeling between males as anything but good, as long as the males concerned were mutually motivated toward the good and were not, either one of them, gravitating toward evil. Now, there are certain other aspects of the legend or story of Ananda that point to a definite queerness, and by queerness I mean a gender and sexual nonconformity in his nature. And I'm looking at this queerness in the context of Indian culture of the time. Ananda challenged the patriarchal and misogynistic assumptions of his time. He was a great advocate for the admission for the establishment of an order of nuns, of Buddhist nuns, and he was actually more, in our terms, progressive in this than the Buddha himself, who only agreed to establish an order of nuns very reluctantly and with serious misgivings. And Ananda was also described, well, as very handsome. I don't know if that makes him gay, but it helps. Very handsome and very popular. He was a very popular preacher among female devotees, and the legends and stories suggest that he really seemed to have a special sympathy for women, and one explanation of this is that he himself had a previous birth as a woman, and this is quite unusual in the Jataka stories, there's one particular story in which it talks about a virtuous princess, and who is, it turns out, Ananda in a past life. And she relates how long ago she had been a blacksmith's son and had fallen into bad company and corrupted other men's wives. And as a punishment for this heterosexual adultery, that she was born as a woman and would be born again for 6 more times as a woman before being promoted and being born as a man. And this story, story of Buddha's past births, Jataka stories, also talks about the births before Ananda's births before he was a woman, and which were also a punishment for his sexual sins. And they go in a kind of a karmic evolutionary order, from lower to higher, beginning with birth as a castrated goat used to draw a cart, and continuing as a monkey who was castrated by his father, who was the leader of the band of monkeys, and who bit off his testicles. I don't want to go into the Freudian implications with it. Leave that one alone. He was then born as a handsome but castrated ox. And finally, and it was very interesting to discover this, was reported that he was born as a third-sex person, and we might consider a transgendered person. In Sanskrit word is napumsaka. And this is really considered in India a third sex distinct from males and females. And in fact, this is known in Buddhist countries, the fact that Ananda had been born as a third sex person. This has been somewhat influential, and there's a mention in the article by Peter Jackson, and I think that's in your book, that in Thailand and some of the Thai Buddhist accounts of homosexuality, they mention that, and they mention being gay or being transgendered as a result of karma, and therefore something that should be accepted and treated with compassion. So, at least in Thailand, there's people see this type of connection between being differently gendered or a different sexual orientation and the figure of Ananda. And there's some other, throughout the Jataka stories, there is this recurrent theme of the Bodhisattva, who is the Buddha in previous lives, and he always has a friend, or very often he has a good friend. And the good friend, unlike wives in these stories, is always very, very faithful. And story after story, the Bodhisattva's friend plays a significant part, and 9 times out of 10, the friend eventually is identified as the person or the continuum, which will be Ananda in the future. For example, there's Jatakas which tell of the 3 former births of the Bodhisattva and Ananda, first as 2 low caste people, and then as 2 deer, and this is so beautiful. They always went around together, ruminating and cuddling together, very happy, head to head, nozzle to nozzle, and horn to horn. And it's so beautiful. And then as 2 osprey, and they were also extremely devoted. Finally, there's another Jataka story which really, very clearly gets to the homoerotic significance of the Ananda legend, and this is called the jewel neck Jataka, Manikanta. In this story, now we come to the cobra. A naga, or a kind of divine cobra, comes out of the Ganges River, disguised as a handsome Brahmin youth, and he approaches the younger of there are 2 brothers who would become ascetics. They become very sad and disillusioned after the death of their parents, and they decide to lead a life of meditation and asceticism. And so he approaches the younger of these brothers, who it turns out later was Ananda, of course. And it says the serpent kind of chatted him up. He talked nicely to him. And after a while, they, quote, became intimate and could not live without each other. Just wonderful description of falling in love. And Jewel Neck would come to the ascetic's hermitage and sit down and talk and converse with him. And after a while, he would stay, and then when it was time for him to go, instead of just going away, as it says, out of affection for the ascetic, he would lay aside, he would put down his human form and encircle him with his snaky coils and embrace him, and holding his hood over his head. And of course, this image suggests some of the great figures in Buddhism and in other Indian religions who are seen as being protected by the cobra, by the naga. You've probably seen some of this in artistic representations. This was the case with the Buddha. Also, Vishnu is protected by the cobra, Parshvanatha, one of the giant saints. So this was actually considered a very auspicious thing, to have the protection of the naga. But he also wraps himself around him, and then it says he remains in that position, and then the old translation, Victorian translation, says he dispelled his affection. And you say, well, what does that mean, to dispel your affection? And actually, the Pali is Sneham Vinoditva, and it really means having released his sneha. And sneha means, it does mean affection. It can also mean desire or lust, and it also has a very concrete meaning of a sticky, oily fluid. Okay, draw your own conclusions. I translate as the sticky love fluid. So he releases the sticky love fluid. Then he unwinds his coils, bows down to the ascetic, and goes back to his home in the river. Now, it says the ascetic became very frightened by these encounters, and he became sick and turned yellow and became emaciated, and he just sort of distraught, and he doesn't know what to do. And he visits his older brother, asking him, what should I do about this? And the older brother, again, it's very interesting, he tells him this story, and he doesn't make any kind of moral judgment. He doesn't say, oh, yeah, having sex with a snake, it's terrible. He just says, he just asks his brother whether he wants the Cobra King to keep visiting him or not. What do you want? And the brother says, no, he doesn't want him to keep visiting. He's frightened by these encounters. So he advises him, gives him very worldly advice that he should pretend to be a gold digger and ask the Cobra King for his jewel, this jewel that he wears at his neck, hence his name. And this is a jewel which is very valuable and also gives the cobra great powers to get wealth and goods and the things that he needs to live. So this is be like asking someone for their life savings. And he tells him to ask for this jewel, and it's an incredible coincidence. The Pali could be translated with there's a very, very famous high camp line from a very bad movie by Maria Montez, who was immortalized by asking, "Give me the cobra jewel," and that's how the Pali translates. Give me the cobra jewel. Give me the jewel, actually. And so the ascetic tries this. 3 times he asks Jewel Neck for his jewel, and he refuses. He says, "You're asking too much." And he then disappears into the Ganges and never doesn't return. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, this doesn't make the ascetic happy. On the contrary, he becomes sickened with grief and once again becomes very thin and jaundiced. And here's the title. As it says, the reason why he became sick was because of not seeing the handsome Naga king. And he once again visits his older brother, who concludes that this ascetic cannot live without the Naga king. And then he relates what's ostensibly the moral of this story, and the Victorian translation is lovely here. It says, "Importune not a man whose love you prize, for begging makes you hateful in his eyes." Don't be a gold digger. And the story concludes by having the older brother console the younger brother. They return to their spiritual practice and ultimately attain a very high heavenly state. And this is a well-known story in the Buddhist world. It's been depicted in India and in other Buddhist countries. And I'm wondering, what is the real moral that we can draw from this very strange story? And thinking someone who was rather facetious could phrase it as, boyfriends can't live with him, can't live without him. and it does express this tension that's inherent in the Buddhist view of same-sex love and friendship. In other words, their friendship was fine. Male friendship is fine up to a point. But when it becomes too sticky, too personal, too exclusive, it's seen as posing a danger to the spiritual life, to the detachment, at least in the Pali tradition, which is seen as really essential to achieving liberation, freedom from pain. It obviously, he had great pain at the loss of the Cobra King. Psychodynamically, we could look at these brothers who've retreated as ascetics, as really having a defense. This is really a defense against the pain of their grieving for their parents, and also that they won't suffer future losses. And also this is a defense against underlying fears of sexuality. And this defense was undermined for the younger brother by his love for the Cobra King and precipitating this illness, which you could look at as psychosomatic, psychogenic kind of an illness. And, when he loses his friend, I guess, retrospectively diagnosing him, it sounds like a kind of a melancholic depression, just a kind of a wasting away. Now, the solution presented in the story is to return to the original defenses, to retreat into solitude and detachment once and for all. And from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, this is very admirable. This would be creating karma which would be favorable to the eventual achievement of liberation, but it doesn't really speak to the emotional need that's revealed in the story. And so just to summarize here, that Ananda is seen as a paradigm for selfless love and devotion to the Buddha, and really a model for all Buddhist disciples. And at the same time, and without any seeming contradiction, he's revealed as a person who had a very human attachment to his dear friend Shariputra, as well as to the Buddha himself. His legend presents a gender atypical individual who had experienced in his past births life as a woman and as a third sex person, and as a man who had an erotic attachment to another male, and one of a different species at that. Not to mention his long series of births as the devoted, loving friend of the future Buddha. My question, and to all of you, is whether, without doing violence to the Buddhist tradition, whether we can see Ananda as some kind of exemplar or a role model for gay male Buddhist practitioners. And I think there are some things to be said in favor of this. So this kind of appropriation of Ananda as an honored ancestor by gay male Buddhists, just as some gay Christians have taken John, the dearly beloved disciple of Jesus, or Saint Sebastian, or Saint Sergius and Bacchus, and people they've seen in the Christian tradition as being gay or queer. And the story of Ananda's service to the Buddha, his very unselfish service to the Buddha, to the Sangha, is certainly totally in accordance with Buddhist ideals. And I think it also reverberates with the well-known overrepresentation of gay men across many cultures in service professions of all kinds, of nurses and waiters and therapists and shamans and priests and flight attendants and massage therapists and hairdressers and teachers, and all of these are ways of serving others, as well as in the arts, which are also ways of pleasing and making others happy. The whole ideal of virtuous friendship, of selfless virtuous friendship, a great Buddhist ideal, which is exemplified by Ananda, is certainly, I think, a potential source of inspiration to gay male relationships, just as the Platonic ideal has been to people in the past. And I think can serve as a much needed corrective to the kind of hedonistic, superficial ideals that are presented in the commodified gay culture. But on the other hand, there are problems in taking Ananda as a model, because he had to according to the stories, eventually cut the last vestiges of emotional attachment, to the Buddha after the death of the Buddha, in order to obtain sainthood, arhatship. And there is a contradiction between these type of particular friendships, as they're called in the Catholic tradition, and the Buddhist ideals of really a universalistic and detached benevolence, which are expressed in the ideals of loving kindness and compassion, metta and karuna, and they're really not meant to be particular. They're meant to be all-embracing and universal. And even in the optimal male relationship from the Buddhist point of view, which would be two men, two friends living together and devoting themselves to Buddhist practice, as Ananda and the Buddha are represented as doing in some of the Janaka stories, that's fine up to that point. But then if you look at a sexual relationship, any type of sexual contact, at least in non-tantric Buddhism, would really be considered an obstacle to spiritual growth, because it would inevitably increase desire and attachment, which are considered to be the causes of suffering in this life and in future births. And think of a famous San Francisco writer. I don't know if he's still alive. Irving Rosenthal. Is anyone familiar with his writings? Wrote a wonderful book called Sleeper. But he was very attracted to Buddhism, and what he said was, I love everything in Buddhism, and I believe everything in Buddhism except for the giving up of desire. That's that's a big thought. And somehow, these are contradictions, but I think maybe in some way they can come together, and people can find some kind of a synthesis, some kind of a new synthesis here. And perhaps the example of Ananda will serve some of us as a guide in trying to do this. Thank you.
You want to take questions?
I would really welcome discussion and questions and comments.
We're running a little late, but we should take time for a couple of questions.
Yeah. Mark.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you in your personal life deal with the issue of desire in your own Buddhist practice?
Well, I find it a contradiction, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I am in a relationship, and we've been together for many, many years. Not a monogamous relationship, and I find it difficult to. I guess I see the Buddhist ideals as something to strive for, and certainly it's not a place where I'm not there, where I can consider the homeless person on the street with the same compassion as my dear friend. I mean, even leaving aside the sexual aspect, that's pretty tough. I mean, that's asking an awful lot of people, and I think it's a wonderful ego ideal. But I guess I hope I live kind of simply and try not to get too caught up into the whole commodity capitalist kind of culture, which is all founded on increasing desire and being dissatisfied and wanting more fabulous cars and clothes, and so maybe in that aspect I try to keep a distance.
Any other questions?
Comments?
Well, there is all this controversy recently with the Dalai Lama he seems to go both ways as far as sometimes it's through the Buddhist Dharma, there is no sin. You don't use that word. I guess it's not a Buddhist word, but there's nothing wrong with gay sexuality. And other times there is something that's forbidden by the Dharma text and so on. And I just wondered what your take is on that whole controversy, on his positions and others like that.
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. In Buddhism, there isn't a sense of gay sex as being sinful, but there is a sense, at least in kind of mainstream Buddhism, of all sexuality and all desire not being finally conducive to spiritual goals, being Buddhism is not it's not a homophobic belief system at all. I mean, there's no sense of having sex with men is really any different than having sex with women or animals or third sex people. As far as actual penetration and sexual behavior, I mean, that's of course forbidden to monks who have vows. As far as lay people, I think the normative view is that the more, as I mentioned in the paper, the sexual contact is bad in the sense that it increases the desire for more sexual contact, for more desire. It just increases that kind of desire and attachment that keep us from pursuing Dharma. So in that case, they're all generally bad. Now, what the Dalai Lama has cited are some scholastic texts which specifically prohibit a whole variety of sexual contact, not just gay sex, but as they put it, putting the penis in the wrong orifices, oral sex with a woman, or having heterosexual sex on certain fast days, or in the presence of religious objects. And these are really scholastic elaborations that had no effect among the Tibetan lay people. Sexual morality for non-monks is really not an issue in Tibetan society. So when the Dalai Lama was asked about this, I think he gave the party line as far as, well, this is the doctrine that's in the texts. As I say, it really was not something that, there was certainly widespread homosexuality in Tibet, both in the monasteries and to some extent outside the monasteries, and no one really thought anything of it. So there's kind of, I think this is just my own opinion, is that, he was put in a position where he had to give some kind of a public judgment. As he said, people are wanting me to be like the Pope, and I'm not the Pope. He's, Dalai Lama was never a figure that, told people how to lead their personal lives. So, actually, I think it's more of a tempest in a teapot, and that he certainly has no animus, no bad feelings toward gay people. There are many gay people who've been working with the Dalai Lama for many years, and I don't think he makes any kind of distinction there.
I just wanted to say something about
Sure.
that. When in 1989, I think it was 89, when the Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was up at Mount Tam, and this von Dorsey, who I was hanging out with at the time, was invited to go meet him, and so we went up, and so I was kind of like his attendant. And so we met the Dalai Lama, and basically they just fell into each other's arms. So I mean, I didn't get that feeling. I mean, that's the way I got a feeling that the Dalai Lama and knew he was gay, obviously, knew he was doing work in the gay community and doing hospice work and taking care of people with HIV and all that. I mean, I see both sides of the issue in the sense, I haven't really talked about this much, I see both sides of the issue in that Dalai Lama is an important Buddhist teacher and people listen to him. So there's always that argument. But the other side of that to me is how wonderfully accepting he's been historically of many groups and gay people included in close association with gay students. So I also think if you see pictures of the Dalai Lama, it's sort of interesting. He's always holding people's hands. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. When I met him, that's the first thing he did was he put his hands out. He holds your hands immediately. Like he makes a connection automatically, and he doesn't treat anybody differently than anyone else.
Yeah.
There's a view in Buddhist teachings that sexual relations get in the way of one's spiritual development. And there's been a trend among Christian denominations in the United States in recent years to allow and perhaps even encourage lay ministers. And I've noticed recently within Buddhism that there are some individuals who, including gay and non-gay monks or whomever, that are also talking about that, and some of them are practicing that. In other words, they're in a relationship, they spiritual development if you're in a sexual and spiritual relationship.
Well, I don't know that Buddhism has much to say about that. Christianity does have more to say about the kinds of virtues that you can have in a relationship, in a marriage. Again, looking at the central tradition in Buddhism has been to leave all attachments. The phrase is leaving home and getting away as the Buddha did, and that's the model. He left his wife, his young son, his family, and to lead a life as a celibate monk is generally considered to be kind of the highest ideal. Now, in Tibetan Buddhism, you do have married monks or married religious figures, so there is more latitude, and of course also in Japan, you have most of the Japanese priests are married, so there has been some kind of broadening of that. As far as, and this is something that Dalai Lama mentioned too in an earlier interview, if a person is a practitioner, a person has taken vows, and you look at the 5 basic vows in Buddhism, and one of them is the vow not to commit sexual misconduct, and really the central meaning of sexual misconduct in Buddhist societies has been the adultery, having sex with other people's partners. So I think if a person was a practitioner and was in a relationship, that certainly being faithful to that relationship would be something that would be expected of that person if they had taken, these are, the 5 vows are pretty basic to being a Buddhist, being a Buddhist practitioner. Yeah.
I guess what I interpreted or what I heard, and it seems to be truly the most important point of the teachings around sexuality and sexual relations, was to avoid the exclusivity of romantic love. That's kind of what I derive from what you're saying, and how that, in a sense, cuts people off from the broader spectrum from other people. Sure. And I guess the teachings are based on the assumption that sexual interactions or sexual relations lead to that exclusion. That's an inevitability. Yeah. My question is there an alternative viewpoint within the Buddhist tradition outside of the Tantra, I guess?
In Tantra, yeah.
Yeah, but that is okay. And then also the assumption that sexuality will always lead to, or sexual activity always leads to more desire. And that's also questioned. or as an alternative?
Well, again, Tantra, which is something I don't really want to speak much about because it's not a great area of my knowledge.
Okay.
But from what little I know of Tantra is that, and actually these meditation texts I'm working on use some of the tantric ideas about instead of just getting rid of the three poisons of lust and hatred and ignorance, that there's a way of using them, so that you can use them in a positive way toward spiritual goals, but yet your motivation, person's motivation, has to be, extremely altruistic. So a person already has to have realized the bodhicitta, the enlightenment mind. A person has to be doing this completely for the service of others, completely toward leading other people to enlightenment, and not toward, their own particular aims or desires or purposes. And that's when you can use desire, and you can use these other psychological poisons in a positive way, but it's considered to be very, very dangerous unless you know what you're doing. Yeah.
I always find the selecting of role models rather dangerous in that it ultimately becomes limiting and restrictive and exclusive in what you end up with as a role model. But that said, since we've examined this case, are there other personalities or characters that you've looked at that could be role models to give you rather a richness of role models rather than a one?
Oh, there's certainly a wide variety in Buddhism, and if you're looking at people who are leading a lay life, you have a figure like Vimalakirti in the Vimalakirti Sutra, who was a householder and had all of these possessions and had a family, but was able to do this in a way he had completely realized emptiness. And so he was able to have these things and to be in this environment and yet not to be in any way attached to it. So that would be one example, and many others. As far as people we know who are teachers and other people that we feel that attraction to. There's people we admire, and we want to be like these kinds of people. Both living people and historical people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.